Question 1. Compliance review shows a former inmate in Alabama is alleging that the conditions of his confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment, specifically citing prolonged periods in an unheated cell during winter months without adequate bedding, leading to severe illness. Which of the following analyzes best addresses the inmate's claim under Alabama criminal law and procedure? Option A. Analyze whether the unheated cell and lack of adequate bedding created objectively severe conditions, and whether prison officials were deliberately indifferent to a substantial risk of serious harm to the inmate's health and safety. Option B. Evaluate the financial cost to the state of providing adequate heating and bedding, and if it is deemed too high, dismiss the claim as unreasonable. Option C. Conclude that any discomfort or illness experienced by an inmate is inherently cruel and unusual punishment, regardless of the specific circumstances or intent of prison officials. Option D. Determine if the inmate's original conviction was for a serious felony, which might justify harsher conditions of confinement. Correct answer is A. Analyze whether the unheated cell and lack of adequate bedding created objectively severe conditions, and whether prison officials were deliberately indifferent to a substantial risk of serious harm to the inmate's health and safety. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments as applied in Alabama, balancing the state's interest in public safety and punishment with the constitutional rights of incarcerated individuals. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate, albeit harsh, prison conditions and those that cross the constitutional line into being cruel and unusual. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overreach in punishing individuals and the violation of fundamental rights. The best professional approach involves a thorough examination of the specific conditions of confinement in light of established Eighth Amendment jurisprudence, considering the totality of the circumstances. This means assessing whether the alleged deprivations are objectively severe and whether the prison officials acted with deliberate indifference to the substantial risk of serious harm. This approach is correct because it directly applies the legal standard for Eighth Amendment violation, which requires proof of both objective severity and subjective deliberate indifference. Alabama courts, like federal courts, interpret the Eighth Amendment to protect against punishments that are deliberately inflicted and are so totally without penological justification that they result in the unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain. This requires a fact-specific inquiry into the nature of the conditions, the duration of exposure, and the knowledge and actions of the responsible officials, an approach that focuses solely on the severity of the crime for which the individual is incarcerated is professionally unacceptable. This fails to recognize that the Eighth Amendment's protections apply regardless of the offense committed. The focus is on the punishment itself, not the underlying crime. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that any discomfort or hardship experienced by an inmate is automatically cruel and unusual. This ignores the reality that incarceration inherently involves restrictions and unpleasant conditions, and the constitutional standard requires more than mere discomfort. It demands a showing of objective severity and deliberate indifference to a substantial risk of harm. Finally, an approach that dismisses claims of cruel and unusual punishment based on the cost of improving conditions is also professionally flawed. While cost is a practical consideration, it cannot override constitutional protections. The Eighth Amendment does not permit the infliction of cruel and unusual punishment, simply because it is cheaper to do so. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the alleged conditions against the established legal standards. This includes gathering all relevant facts, understanding the specific allegations of harm, identifying the responsible parties, and assessing their state of mind. Deliberate indifference. Professionals must consult relevant case law and statutory provisions to ensure their judgment is grounded in legal precedent and constitutional principles. Question 2. Compliance review shows that a prosecutor in Alabama is considering an arrest based on an informant's tip. The informant claims to have direct knowledge of the defendant possessing illegal narcotics. The prosecutor has not independently verified the informant's reliability or the information provided. What is the most procedurally sound and ethically appropriate course of action for the prosecutor to take in Alabama? Option A. Delay the initial appearance before a magistrate to conduct further interrogation of the defendant regarding the alleged narcotics. Option B. Proceed with the arrest immediately based on the informant's tip as the informant claims direct knowledge. Option C. Initiate a search of the defendant's residence based on the informant's tip without obtaining a search warrant. Option D. Obtain an arrest warrant only after conducting independent corroboration of the informant's tip and ensuring the tip establishes probable cause, then promptly present the defendant for an initial appearance. The correct answer is D. Obtain an arrest warrant only after conducting independent corroboration of the informant's tip and ensuring the tip establishes probable cause, then promptly present the defendant for an initial appearance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a prosecutor's duty to seek justice and the imperative to adhere strictly to the procedural safeguards guaranteed to an accused individual under Alabama law. The prosecutor must balance the desire to secure a conviction with the constitutional and statutory requirements that govern every stage of the criminal process, from arrest to trial. Failure to do so can lead to the suppression of evidence, dismissal of charges, and damage to the integrity of the justice system. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions taken are legally sound and ethically defensible. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously reviewing the arrest warrant and supporting affidavit for probable cause, ensuring that the arrest was conducted in accordance with Alabama rules of criminal procedure, and then promptly presenting the defendant to a judicial officer for an initial appearance. This approach prioritizes adherence to the foundational principles of Alabama criminal procedure, specifically the requirement for lawful arrest based on probable cause and the prompt presentment of the accused to a magistrate. Alabama law, as reflected in Rule 3, Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure, mandates that an arrest warrant shall be issued only upon a finding of probable cause. Furthermore, Rule 4.1a requires that an arrested person be brought before a magistrate without unnecessary delay. This ensures the defendant is informed of their rights and the charges against them, and that the legality of the arrest is judicially reviewed. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the arrest based solely on a tip from an informant without independent corroboration or further investigation fails to meet the probable cause standard required by Alabama law for the issuance of an arrest warrant. This approach risks an unlawful arrest, violating the Fourth Amendment and Alabama Rule 3, delaying the initial appearance before a magistrate to conduct further questioning or gather additional evidence, even if the arrest was initially lawful, violates the prompt presentment requirement under Alabama Rule 4.1a. Such delays can be grounds for challenging the admissibility of any statements made by the defendant during the period of unlawful detention. Initiating a search of the defendant's residence based on the informant's tip without a separate search warrant, even if the arrest was lawful, constitutes an unlawful search and seizure. This violates the Fourth Amendment and Alabama Rule 39, which requires a warrant to search a person's home unless specific exceptions apply, none of which are evident from the provided information. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the governing legal standards. This involves consulting Alabama rules of criminal procedure and relevant case law concerning probable cause, lawful arrest, and initial appearance requirements. The process should then involve a factual assessment of the information available, identifying any deficiencies or areas requiring further investigation to establish probable cause. Crucially, the framework must prioritize constitutional rights and procedural safeguards at every step, ensuring that actions are not only effective in pursuing a conviction, but also legally permissible and ethically sound. When in doubt, seeking guidance from experienced colleagues or legal counsel is a critical component of responsible professional conduct. Question 3. The assessment process reveals that a defendant in Alabama is charged with robbery in the first degree. Evidence suggests the defendant was voluntarily intoxicated at the time of the alleged offense, but the prosecution believes they can still prove the elements of the crime. Considering Alabama criminal law and procedure, which of the following approaches best reflects the legal analysis required to determine the defendant's culpability? Option A. Conclude that voluntary intoxication is a complete defense to robbery in the first degree, regardless of the defendant's mental state or the specific intent required. Option B. Immediately dismiss the intoxication defense as irrelevant to the charge of robbery in the first degree, without further factual inquiry into its potential impact on the defendant's intent. Option C. Focus solely on whether the defendant committed the physical act of taking property by force or threat of force, disregarding the defendant's mental state due to intoxication. Option D. Analyze whether the defendant's voluntary intoxication prevented the formation of the specific intent required for robbery in the first degree, and if so, consider whether a lesser included offense requiring only general intent may have been committed. Correct answer is D. Analyze whether the defendant's voluntary intoxication prevented the formation of the specific intent required for robbery in the first degree, and if so, consider whether a lesser included offense requiring only general intent may have been committed. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the nuanced application of the elements of a crime in Alabama, specifically the distinction between voluntary intoxication as a defense and its impact on the required mental state, mens rea. A prosecutor must carefully consider whether the defendant's intoxication negates the specific intent required for the charged offense, or if it merely reduces the offense to a lesser included crime. This requires a deep understanding of Alabama Code Section 13A3-7 and relevant case law. The best professional approach involves a thorough analysis of the defendant's mental state at the time of the offense, considering the degree of intoxication, and whether it prevented the formation of the specific intent required for the crime of robbery in the first degree under Alabama law. This approach correctly recognizes that voluntary intoxication is not a complete defense to all crimes, but it can negate the specific intent element for certain offenses, potentially leading to a conviction for a lesser offense that does not require specific intent. This aligns with the principle that criminal liability generally requires both a criminal actus reus and a culpable mental state, mens rea. An incorrect approach would be to automatically assume that any level of voluntary intoxication is a complete defense to the charge of robbery in the first degree. This fails to acknowledge that Alabama law, like many jurisdictions, distinguishes between general intent and specific intent crimes. Voluntary intoxication is generally not a defense to general intent crimes. Furthermore, it overlooks the possibility that even if specific intent is negated, the defendant could still be guilty of a lesser included offense that does not require that specific intent, such as robbery in the second or third degree, or assault. Another incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the actus reus of the robbery, such as the taking of property by force or threat of force, without adequately considering the mens rea element. While the physical act is crucial, the prosecution must also prove the defendant possessed the requisite mental state, which for robbery in the first degree includes the intent to permanently deprive the owner of their property. Ignoring the mental state element would be a fundamental failure in proving the crime as defined by Alabama statutes. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to dismiss the intoxication defense entirely without a factual inquiry into its severity and its effect on the defendant's ability to form the specific intent. Alabama law permits voluntary intoxication to be considered when it negates the specific intent element of a crime. Failing to investigate this aspect would be a dereliction of the prosecutor's duty to seek justice, which includes considering all relevant defenses and their impact on the elements of the crime. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a meticulous examination of the elements of the charged offense under Alabama law, a thorough factual investigation into the defendant's mental state and the circumstances surrounding the alleged crime, and a careful application of relevant statutory provisions and case precedents. This ensures that charges are appropriately brought and that convictions are based on a complete understanding of all required elements. Question 4. Implementation of Alabama criminal law requires a precise understanding of mens rea. Considering the facts of case where a driver, while speeding excessively through a residential neighborhood, narrowly avoids hitting several children playing near the road, which of the following best reflects the appropriate legal analysis of the driver's mental state under Alabama law? Option A. Assuming criminal negligence solely because the driver's actions created a dangerous situation and a near miss occurred, without specific evidence of the driver's failure to perceive the risk. Option B. Concluding that the driver acted with intent to cause harm simply because the outcome was dangerous, overlooking the distinction between intent and recklessness. Option C. Focusing exclusively on the fact that the driver was speeding, without further inquiry into their subjective awareness of the risks associated with that speed in that specific environment. Option D. analyzing whether the driver consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk that their conduct could cause harm to others, considering their awareness of the speed and the presence of a residential area. The correct answer is D. Analyzing whether the driver consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk that their conduct could cause harm to others, considering their awareness of the speed and the presence of a residential area. Explanation: the scenario presents a challenge in distinguishing between different levels of mens rea, specifically recklessness and criminal negligence, under Alabama law. The difficulty lies in the subtle but crucial difference between consciously disregarding a known risk, recklessness, and failing to perceive a risk that a reasonable person would have perceived, criminal negligence. This distinction is paramount in determining criminal liability and the appropriate charges. The best approach involves a meticulous examination of the defendant's subjective state of mind at the time of the act. This requires analyzing the defendant's knowledge of the circumstances, their awareness of the potential consequences, and whether they consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk. Alabama Code Section 13A2-5 defines recklessness as consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk that a material element exists or will result from conduct. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory definitions of mens rea in Alabama criminal law, focusing on the defendant's actual mental state as opposed to a hypothetical reasonable person's. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the objective outcome of the defendant's actions without adequately assessing their subjective intent or awareness. For instance, assuming criminal negligence simply because a dangerous outcome occurred, without proving the defendant's failure to perceive a substantial and unjustifiable risk, is a regulatory failure. Alabama Code Section 13A2-4 defines criminal negligence as a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise. Equating a bad outcome with negligence without establishing the defendant's subjective failure to perceive the risk misinterprets the statutory requirement. Another incorrect approach is to conflate recklessness with intent. While intent involves a conscious objective to engage in certain conduct or cause a certain result, recklessness involves awareness of a risk. Assuming recklessness when the evidence points to a conscious objective to cause harm would be a misapplication of the law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific mens rea elements required for the charged offense under Alabama law. This involves a thorough review of the evidence to establish the defendant's subjective awareness of risks and their conscious choices. When the evidence is ambiguous, professionals must consider whether it supports a finding of recklessness, conscious disregard of a known risk, or criminal negligence, failure to perceive a risk a reasonable person would have. The burden of proof rests on the prosecution to establish the requisite mens rea beyond a reasonable doubt, and any analysis must reflect this standard. Question 5. To address the challenge of establishing criminal liability in Alabama, consider a scenario where a parent, who has a legal duty to care for their young child, fails to seek medical attention for the child's rapidly worsening fever and dehydration. The child subsequently suffers severe and permanent organ damage as a direct result of the untreated condition. Which of the following analyses most accurately reflects the determination of actus reus in this Alabama criminal law context? Option A. The actus reus is established by the parent's intent to harm the child, as the parent must have desired the negative outcome for criminal liability to attach. Option B. The actus reus is established by the parent's general failure to supervise the child, as any lapse in supervision that results in harm constitutes the physical act required for criminal culpability. Option C. The actus reus is established by the child's suffering of organ damage, as this is the harmful outcome that the criminal law seeks to prevent, regardless of the parent's actions or inactions. Option D. The actus reus is established by the parent's omission to seek medical attention, as a legal duty of care existed due to the parent-child relationship, and this omission directly led to the child's harm. Correct answer is D. The actus reus is established by the parent's omission to seek medical attention, as a legal duty of care existed due to the parent-child relationship, and this omission directly led to the child's harm. Explanation: to address the challenge of determining criminal liability for an actus reus in Alabama, A legal professional must carefully analyze the defendant's conduct against the elements of the offense. This scenario is professionally challenging because the actus reus, the physical component of a crime, can be complex, involving not just affirmative actions, but also omissions where a legal duty exists. Misinterpreting the nature of the act or omission can lead to incorrect charges or acquittals, impacting justice and public safety. The correct approach involves a thorough examination of the specific Alabama criminal statute allegedly violated. This requires identifying whether the statute criminalizes a voluntary act, an omission, or a status offense. If the alleged actus reus is an omission, the analysis must then determine if a legally recognized duty to act existed, such as a duty arising from a special relationship, e.g., parent-child, a statute, a contractual obligation, or voluntary assumption of care. The defendant's conduct must then be assessed to see if it constitutes a failure to perform that duty. For example, under Alabama law, a person generally has no duty to rescue another. But if a parent fails to provide necessary medical care for their child, that omission can constitute criminal conduct if it leads to harm, as a special relationship imposes a duty. The focus must be on whether the defendant's physical conduct, or lack thereof, directly caused the prohibited result, aligning with the mens rea element. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any harmful outcome automatically implies criminal liability, without first establishing a voluntary act or a legally recognized omission. This fails to adhere to the fundamental principle that criminal liability requires a culpable mental state, mens rea, coupled with a guilty act, actus reus. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the defendant's intent or mental state, neglecting the requirement for a physical act or omission. Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, requires both mens rea and actus reus for most criminal offenses. Furthermore, an incorrect approach would be to consider involuntary acts, such as reflexes or movements during unconsciousness, as sufficient for actus reus, as criminal law generally punishes voluntary conduct. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, identify the specific criminal statute and its elements, paying close attention to the definition of the actus reus. Second, analyze the defendant's conduct to determine if it constitutes a voluntary act or a legally recognized omission. Third, if an omission is alleged, ascertain the existence and scope of any legal duty to act. Fourth, evaluate whether the defendant's conduct or failure to act directly caused the prohibited result. Finally, consider the defendant's mental state in conjunction with the actus reus to determine criminal culpability. Question 6. The review process indicates that a defendant in Alabama is charged with aggravated assault. Evidence shows the defendant, while intoxicated, initially engaged in a verbal altercation with the victim. During the argument, the defendant's intoxication worsened, and he then picked up a nearby object and struck the victim, causing serious injury. The prosecution argues that the defendant's actions constitute aggravated assault, but defense counsel contends that the defendant's severe intoxication negated the required criminal intent at the time of the assault. Considering Alabama criminal law, which approach best addresses the concurrence of mens rea and actus reus in this scenario? Option A. Focus on the severity of the victim's injuries as the primary factor in establishing the defendant's guilt, assuming that such severe injuries could only have been inflicted with criminal intent. Option B. Determine guilt based on the fact that the defendant initiated a verbal altercation, implying a pre-existing hostile intent that carries over to the physical assault. Option C. Conclude that the defendant is guilty because he committed a physical act that resulted in serious bodily harm, regardless of his mental state due to intoxication. Option D. Analyze whether the defendant possessed the specific intent to cause serious bodily harm at the moment he struck the victim, considering the impact of his intoxication on his mental state at that precise time. Correct answer is D. Analyze whether the defendant possessed the specific intent to cause serious bodily harm at the moment he struck the victim, considering the impact of his intoxication on his mental state at that precise time. Explanation. The review process indicates that this scenario presents a professionally challenging situation due to the subtle interplay between a defendant's mental state and their physical actions, particularly when the mental state fluctuates or is influenced by external factors. Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, requires the concurrence of mens rea, guilty mind, and actus reus, guilty act, for a criminal conviction. The challenge lies in determining if the requisite mental state existed at the precise moment the prohibited act occurred, especially when the act is a continuous one or involves a series of actions. Careful judgment is required to avoid convicting individuals who lack the necessary criminal intent, or to ensure that those who did possess it are held accountable. The best professional approach involves a meticulous examination of the defendant's mental state immediately preceding and during the commission of the act. This requires considering all available evidence, including witness testimony, the defendant's statements, and any expert opinions, to establish whether the defendant possessed the specific intent or recklessness required by the relevant Alabama statute at the time of the act. For instance, if the act was a continuous one, such as unlawful imprisonment, the prosecution must demonstrate that the defendant harbored the intent to confine the victim throughout the duration of the confinement, not merely at its inception. This approach aligns with Alabama Code Section 13A2-5, which defines criminal liability as requiring a voluntary act or omission accompanied by a culpable mental state. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the presence of a guilty mind at any point before or after the act is sufficient for conviction. This fails to recognize the fundamental principle of concurrence. For example, if a defendant initially intended to commit a lawful act but later developed a criminal intent during the commission of that act, and the act itself became criminal only after the intent changed, simply having a guilty mind at some point is not enough. The guilty mind must exist concurrently with the criminal act. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to focus solely on the physical act, without adequately investigating the defendant's mental state. This ignores the core requirement of mens rea and could lead to the conviction of individuals who acted without criminal intent, perhaps due to mistake, accident, or a lack of awareness of the circumstances. Alabama law requires proof of a culpable mental state, which can range from intent to knowledge, recklessness, or negligence, depending on the offense. Finally, an approach that relies on a generalized assumption of guilt based on the outcome of the act, rather than a specific analysis of the defendant's mental state at the time of the act, is also flawed. This bypasses the crucial element of proving the defendant's subjective mental state and risks convicting individuals who may have committed the act, but lack the necessary criminal intent as defined by Alabama law. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the specific elements of the charged offense under Alabama law, including the required mens rea. This necessitates a careful review of all evidence to determine if the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant possessed the requisite culpable mental state at the precise time the actus reus was committed. If there is doubt regarding the concurrence, the evidence must be interpreted in favor of the defendant. Question 7. Examination of the data shows that in Alabama, a defendant claims self-defense after a physical altercation where the alleged victim initiated the physical contact by pushing the defendant. The defendant then struck the alleged victim multiple times, causing significant injury. The defendant asserts they feared for their safety due to the victim's aggressive demeanor and prior verbal threats. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the legal standards for self-defense in Alabama? Option A. Argue that the defendant's fear, stemming from the victim's aggressive demeanor and prior verbal threats, coupled with the initial physical push, created a reasonable belief of imminent danger, justifying the force used. Option B. Assert that any physical contact initiated by the victim, regardless of its severity or the defendant's subsequent actions, automatically negates the need for the defendant to prove the proportionality of their response. Option C. Focus the defense solely on the alleged victim's history of aggression and past disputes with the defendant, without directly addressing the imminence of the threat at the moment of the physical confrontation. Option D. Contend that the defendant's subjective feeling of fear, irrespective of objective evidence or the proportionality of the force used, is sufficient to establish a valid claim of self-defense. The correct answer is A. Argue that the defendant's fear, stemming from the victim's aggressive demeanor and prior verbal threats, coupled with the initial physical push, created a reasonable belief of imminent danger, justifying the force used. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent difficulty in distinguishing between genuine self-defense and an overzealous or retaliatory response, particularly when the perceived threat is subjective and the physical altercation has already begun. The legal standard in Alabama for self-defense requires a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm, and the force used must be proportionate to the perceived threat. Misjudging these elements can lead to a wrongful conviction or an unjustified acquittal, impacting both justice and public trust. The best professional approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of all available evidence, focusing on the defendant's reasonable perception of imminent danger at the moment force was used, and whether the force employed was necessary and proportionate. This requires considering the aggressor's actions, the defendant's physical capabilities, the presence of weapons, and any prior interactions that might inform the defendant's state of mind. Alabama law, as codified in statutes like the Alabama Criminal Code, permits the use of deadly force only when a person reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to themselves or another person. The analysis must strictly adhere to these statutory definitions, and case law interpretations regarding imminence and proportionality. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the defendant's subjective fear, without corroborating evidence of an imminent threat. This fails to meet the objective reasonableness standard required by Alabama law. If the evidence suggests the defendant was the initial aggressor, or that the threat had already passed when force was used, then self-defense would not be legally justified. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any physical resistance constitutes self-defense, regardless of the proportionality of the force used. Alabama law requires that the force used be no more than is necessary to repel the attack. Using excessive force, even in response to an initial assault, can negate a self-defense claim. Furthermore, focusing on the victim's character or past behavior, without direct relevance to the immediate threat faced by the defendant, is an improper basis for a self-defense argument. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective evidence over subjective claims. This involves meticulously gathering and analyzing witness statements, physical evidence, and the defendant's own account, always measuring these against the specific legal requirements for self-defense under Alabama law. The focus should remain on the defendant's reasonable belief of imminent danger and the proportionality of their actions at the precise moment the force was applied. Question 8. Upon reviewing the facts of a physical altercation in Mobile, Alabama, where the defendant claims they acted in self-defense after being verbally threatened and then shoved by the victim, what is the most legally sound approach to evaluating the justification defense? Option A. Assess whether the defendant reasonably believed they were in imminent danger of bodily harm, and if the force used was no more than reasonably necessary to repel the unlawful force, considering all circumstances as they appeared to the defendant at the time. Option B. Determine that because the defendant was shoved, they had an absolute right to use any amount of force necessary to incapacitate the victim, without regard to the proportionality of the force used. Option C. Focus exclusively on the victim's aggressive verbal threats and disregard the defendant's physical response, assuming the threats alone created a sufficient justification for any level of force. Option D. Conclude that any physical resistance to an unlawful shove, regardless of the surrounding circumstances or the defendant's subjective fear, is automatically justified self-defense under Alabama law. The correct answer is A. Assess whether the defendant reasonably believed they were in imminent danger of bodily harm, and if the force used was no more than reasonably necessary to repel the unlawful force, considering all circumstances as they appeared to the defendant at the time. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in assessing the reasonableness of force when self-defense is claimed. The legal standard in Alabama requires that the force used be no more than is reasonably necessary to repel the unlawful force. This involves a fact-specific inquiry, considering the circumstances as they appeared to the defendant at the time of the incident. A key element is the defendant's reasonable belief that they were in imminent danger of bodily harm, and that the force used was necessary to prevent that harm. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the evidence to determine if the defendant's actions were objectively reasonable given the perceived threat. This includes considering the nature of the threat, the defendant's physical capabilities, the presence of any weapons, and the proportionality of the force used to the perceived danger. Alabama law, particularly under Title 13A, Chapter 5 of the Code of Alabama, addresses justification defenses, including self-defense. The analysis must focus on whether the defendant acted under a reasonable apprehension of imminent bodily harm, and whether the force employed was the minimum necessary to neutralize that threat. This requires a careful weighing of the defendant's subjective belief against an objective standard of reasonableness. An approach that focuses solely on the defendant's subjective fear without considering the objective reasonableness of their belief is flawed. While the defendant's state of mind is important, the law requires that this fear be one that a reasonable person in similar circumstances would also experience. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any physical resistance to an unlawful act automatically constitutes justified self-defense. Alabama law does not grant a blanket right to use any level of force in response to any unlawful act. The force must be proportionate and necessary. Furthermore, an approach that ignores the duty to retreat, where applicable and safe, could also be problematic, although Alabama law generally does not impose a duty to retreat in one's home. However, in other locations, the failure to consider retreat when it was a safe option would be a significant legal failing. Professionals should approach such situations by first establishing the factual predicate of the alleged threat. Then, they must apply the objective reasonableness standard to the defendant's subjective belief, considering all surrounding circumstances. This involves a detailed review of witness statements, physical evidence, and the defendant's account, all filtered through the lens of Alabama's justification defense statutes. The ultimate goal is to determine if the defendant's actions, viewed from their perspective at the time, were a legally justifiable response to an imminent threat of bodily harm. Question 9. When evaluating the potential for an excuse defense in a criminal case in Alabama, a prosecutor reviews the facts surrounding a defendant's actions. The defendant claims they committed theft to feed their starving family, arguing they had no other means to obtain food, and that the harm of their family starving was greater than the harm of the theft. Which of the following analyzes most accurately reflects the application of Alabama criminal law regarding excuse defenses? Option A. The prosecutor should assess whether the defendant's actions meet the strict legal elements of the necessity defense under Alabama law, which requires demonstrating an immediate threat of serious harm and a lack of reasonable legal alternatives, and that the harm avoided was greater than the harm caused. Option B. Prosecutor should focus on whether the defendant could have sought charitable assistance, and if not, then the defense is invalid, as the law expects individuals to exhaust all social welfare options before resorting to illegal acts. Option C. The prosecutor should consider the defendant's intent to provide for their family as sufficient grounds for an excuse defense, as the moral imperative to protect one's family outweighs the legal prohibition against theft. Option D. The prosecutor should dismiss any possibility of an excuse defense because the act of theft is inherently illegal, regardless of the defendant's motivations or the circumstances. The correct answer is A. The prosecutor should assess whether the defendant's actions meet the strict legal elements of the necessity defense under Alabama law, which requires demonstrating an immediate threat of serious harm and a lack of reasonable legal alternatives, and that the harm avoided was greater than the harm caused. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires distinguishing between a genuine excuse defense under Alabama law and a situation where the defendant's actions, while perhaps morally questionable, do not meet the legal threshold for an excuse. The prosecutor must carefully consider the specific elements of the applicable excuse defenses as defined by Alabama statutes and case law, ensuring that any plea or trial strategy is grounded in a sound legal analysis of the facts. Mischaracterizing the defendant's situation could lead to an unjust outcome, either by overcharging or by failing to recognize a valid defense. The best approach involves a thorough review of the facts in light of Alabama's statutory definitions of excuse defenses, such as duress or necessity. This requires assessing whether the defendant acted under an immediate threat of serious bodily harm or death, with no reasonable opportunity to escape, or whether their actions were taken to prevent a greater harm, and if there were no reasonable legal alternatives. If the facts align with the legal elements of a recognized excuse defense, the prosecutor should consider presenting that defense or negotiating a plea that reflects the availability of such a defense. This aligns with the ethical duty to seek justice and uphold the law, ensuring that defendants are held accountable only for conduct that legally constitutes a crime and that valid defenses are recognized. An approach that focuses solely on the defendant's intent to avoid harm, without considering the immediacy of the threat or the lack of reasonable alternatives, fails to adhere to the legal requirements of defenses like duress. Alabama law requires more than just a desire to avoid harm. It demands specific circumstances that negate criminal responsibility. Similarly, an approach that dismisses the defense simply because the defendant's actions resulted in some harm, without weighing that harm against the harm sought to be avoided under the necessity defense, is legally insufficient. The necessity defense, for example, requires that the harm avoided be greater than the harm caused. Finally, an approach that ignores the possibility of a legal excuse because the defendant's actions were unconventional or morally ambiguous, without a rigorous legal analysis, is a failure to properly apply Alabama criminal law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a meticulous factual investigation. This is followed by a detailed legal analysis, comparing the established facts against the elements of all potential defenses, particularly excuse defenses, as defined by Alabama statutes. The prosecutor must then exercise independent judgment, considering the strength of the evidence supporting or refuting the defense, and acting in a manner consistent with the principles of justice and the specific requirements of Alabama criminal law. Question 10. An Alabama law enforcement officer receives a tip from a confidential informant stating that an individual, known to the officer by description but not by name, will be carrying a specific quantity of illegal narcotics at a particular public location within the next hour. The officer proceeds to the location and observes an individual matching the informant's description. The officer notes the individual is carrying a backpack that appears to be of a size and shape consistent with the informant's description of the contraband's concealment. The officer estimates the time elapsed since the tip was received to be 45 minutes. If the officer were to arrest the individual at this precise moment, what is the minimum number of distinct, articulable facts the officer must be able to present to a court to establish probable cause for the arrest? Assuming the informant's tip is the primary source of information, Option A, at least 3 distinct articulable facts. Option B, at least 2 distinct articulable facts. Option C, at least 1 distinct articulable fact. Option D, at least 4 distinct articulable facts. The correct answer is A, at least 3 distinct articulable facts. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between the need for swift law enforcement action and the constitutional rights of individuals. The officer must balance the immediate need to apprehend a suspect with the strict procedural requirements for a lawful arrest in Alabama. Missteps can lead to the suppression of evidence, civil liability, and a breakdown of public trust. The best professional approach involves the officer meticulously documenting the probable cause for the arrest, ensuring it is based on specific, articulable facts and direct observations, rather than mere suspicion or generalized information. This approach aligns with Alabama's adherence to Fourth Amendment principles, which require probable cause for an arrest. Specifically, Alabama Rule of Criminal Procedure 3.1 mandates that an arrest warrant be issued by a judge or magistrate upon a showing of probable cause, or that an arrest without a warrant be based on probable cause. By gathering and articulating these facts, the officer creates a defensible record that can withstand legal scrutiny, ensuring the arrest is lawful and any subsequent evidence is admissible. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the arrest based solely on a tip from an informant without independent corroboration. While an informant's tip can contribute to probable cause, it is generally insufficient on its own without further verification of the informant's reliability and the information provided. This failure to corroborate violates the probable cause standard required by Alabama law and the U.S. Constitution. Another incorrect approach would be to arrest the suspect based on a hunch or a vague feeling of suspicion, without any concrete evidence or observable facts linking the individual to a crime. This subjective assessment is not a substitute for the objective standard of probable cause and would render the arrest unlawful under Alabama's criminal procedure rules. A further incorrect approach involves delaying the arrest for an extended period after developing probable cause, without a compelling reason, and then attempting to justify the delay by claiming the suspect was about to flee. While flight can be a factor in establishing probable cause, the primary justification for the arrest must be the commission of a crime, and the delay itself, if unreasonable, could raise questions about the true basis for the arrest. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the available facts against the legal standard of probable cause. Officers should ask, do I have specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that this individual has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime? If the answer is not a clear yes, Further investigation and corroboration are necessary before an arrest is made. Documentation of these facts and the reasoning process is paramount. Question 11. Comparative studies suggest that the application of the insanity defense can be complex and subject to varying interpretations. In Alabama, if a defense attorney believes their client may qualify for an insanity defense based on their client's reported experiences of dissociation and confusion during the alleged offense, what is the most ethically sound and legally effective approach to pursue this defense? Option A. Rely solely on the defendant's testimony regarding their memory gaps and feelings of confusion to argue for the insanity defense. Option B. Engage qualified forensic mental health professionals to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the defendant's mental state at the time of the alleged offense and present their findings as expert testimony. Option C. Advise the client to plead guilty if the attorney believes the public might perceive the insanity defense negatively. Regardless of the legal merits, Option D. Focus the defense strategy on the defendant's unusual actions observed by witnesses in the days following the alleged crime, without directly linking them to a mental disease or defect at the time of the offense. The correct answer is B. Engage qualified forensic mental health professionals to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the defendant's mental state at the time of the alleged offense and present their findings as expert testimony. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexity of assessing mental state at the time of an alleged offense, particularly when the defendant's behavior and reported experiences are subjective and potentially influenced by various factors. The defense attorney must navigate the legal standards for the insanity defense in Alabama while ensuring their client's rights are protected, and that the defense is presented effectively and ethically. Careful judgment is required to balance the client's interests with the legal requirements and the potential for public perception to influence the proceedings. The best approach involves a thorough and objective evaluation of the defendant's mental state, supported by expert psychiatric testimony, to determine if the Alabama standard for the insanity defense is met. This entails engaging qualified mental health professionals to conduct comprehensive examinations and provide expert opinions on whether the defendant, due to a mental disease or defect, lacked the substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of their conduct or to conform their conduct to the requirements of law at the time of the alleged offense. This approach aligns with Alabama Code Section 13A3-1, which defines the affirmative defense of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, and emphasizes the need for evidence demonstrating the defendant's condition at the time of the offense. It respects the legal framework by focusing on the specific elements required for the defense to be successful. An approach that relies solely on the defendant's subjective claims of memory loss or confusion without independent corroboration or expert evaluation is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the evidentiary burden required by Alabama law, which necessitates proof of a mental disease or defect. Relying only on the defendant's assertions risks presenting a defense that lacks the necessary scientific or medical foundation, potentially leading to its rejection by the court. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to present the insanity defense based on the defendant's unusual behavior observed after the alleged crime, without establishing a direct link between that behavior and their mental state at the time of the offense. Alabama law requires the mental disease or defect to have existed at the time of the criminal act. Focusing on post-offense behavior without demonstrating its connection to the defendant's mental capacity during the commission of the crime is legally insufficient and ethically misleading. Finally, an approach that prioritizes public perception or the attorney's personal belief about the defendant's guilt or innocence over the legal standards and available evidence is also professionally flawed. The attorney's role is to advocate for their client within the bounds of the law, utilizing all legitimate means to present a defense. This includes rigorously investigating the facts and applying the relevant legal standards, rather than being swayed by external pressures or personal biases that do not align with the established legal framework for the insanity defense in Alabama. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant Alabama statutes and case law concerning the insanity defense. This involves diligent factual investigation, consultation with qualified mental health experts, and a critical assessment of the evidence to determine if the legal criteria for the defense can be met. Ethical consideration, including client confidentiality and the duty to present a truthful defense must guide every step of the process. Question 12. The investigation demonstrates that during a heated argument in Birmingham, Alabama, an individual, fearing for their life, used physical force to repel an immediate physical assault by another person who was unarmed but significantly larger and more aggressive. The defender sustained minor injuries before the altercation ended. What is the most appropriate investigative approach to determine the legality of the force used by the defender? Option A. Prioritize gathering evidence that highlights the aggressor's initial hostile actions and aggressive demeanor to establish the defender's justification for using force, regardless of the defender's subjective belief or the proportionality of the force used. Option B. Focus the investigation primarily on the extent of the defender's injuries, as minor injuries may suggest the force used was excessive and not justified by the immediate threat. Option C. Conclude that the use of physical force, even in response to an assault, is unlawful unless the aggressor was armed with a deadly weapon, as this is the primary trigger for justifiable self-defense in Alabama. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all evidence, including witness statements, physical evidence, and any available recordings, to objectively assess the defender's reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm, and the proportionality of the force used in response to the perceived threat, considering the circumstances as they appeared to the defender at the time. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all evidence, including witness statements, physical evidence, and any available recordings, to objectively assess the defender's reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm, and the proportionality of the force used in response to the perceived threat, considering the circumstances as they appeared to the defender at the time. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent ambiguity in assessing the reasonableness of force used in a self-defense situation, particularly when the perceived threat may have diminished or the defender's actions could be seen as excessive. The Alabama legal framework for self-defense, primarily governed by Alabama Code Title 13A, Chapter 5, Section 13A3-23, requires that the force used be justifiable and not excessive in relation to the perceived threat. This necessitates a careful evaluation of the defender's subjective belief and the objective reasonableness of their actions under the circumstances. The best professional approach involves a thorough investigation that prioritizes gathering all available evidence to objectively assess the proportionality of the force used. This includes interviewing all witnesses, collecting physical evidence from the scene, reviewing any available surveillance footage, and obtaining expert opinions on the nature of the altercation and the injuries sustained. The focus must be on determining whether the defender reasonably believed they were in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm, and whether the force used was necessary and not excessive to repel that danger, considering the totality of the circumstances as they appeared to the defender at the time. This aligns with the legal standard that allows for the use of deadly force only when necessary to prevent death or serious bodily harm, an approach that focuses solely on the aggressor's initial actions without considering the defender's subjective belief and the ongoing nature of the threat is professionally flawed. It overlooks the critical element of reasonable apprehension of harm, which is central to self-defense claims. Similarly, an approach that presumes guilt based on the severity of the outcome, rather than meticulously examining the justification for the force used at the moment it was applied, fails to adhere to the legal presumption of innocence and the specific requirements of Alabama's self-defense statutes. Finally, an approach that prematurely concludes the defender acted unlawfully without a comprehensive review of all evidence risks miscarriages of justice and fails to uphold the principles of due process. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with understanding the specific legal standards for self-defense in Alabama. This involves a fact-intensive inquiry, gathering all relevant evidence, and applying the legal framework to the gathered facts. The process should involve an objective assessment of the defender's subjective belief and the reasonableness of their actions, considering the circumstances as they appeared to the defender at the time of the incident. This balanced approach ensures that both the right to self-defense and the prohibition against excessive force are appropriately considered. Question 13. Analysis of the following scenario under Alabama criminal law and procedure. A prosecutor is reviewing evidence in a case where the defendant is accused of robbery in the first degree as defined by Alabama Code Section 13A8-41. The evidence shows that the defendant had a concealed handgun in his possession during an argument with the victim over a debt, and the defendant made threats towards the victim. However, the evidence does not clearly demonstrate that the defendant displayed the weapon or used it to compel the victim to surrender any property, which approach best upholds the principles of Alabama criminal law and procedure in deciding whether to proceed with the charge of robbery in the first degree. Option A. Proceed with the charge if the defendant's threatening behavior and possession of a concealed handgun created a general fear in the victim, regardless of whether the weapon was displayed or used to facilitate the taking of property. Option B. Proceed with the charge by emphasizing the defendant's intent to intimidate the victim, asserting that the presence of a weapon, even if concealed, is sufficient to satisfy the armed with a deadly weapon element of robbery. Option C. Proceed with the charge only if the evidence directly establishes that the defendant took property from the victim by using force or threat of force, and that the defendant was armed with a deadly weapon during the commission of the taking. Option D. Proceed with the charge based on the defendant's prior history of violent behavior, arguing that this history makes it more likely he would commit such an offense. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the charge only if the evidence directly establishes that the defendant took property from the victim by using force or threat of force, and that the defendant was armed with a deadly weapon during the commission of the taking. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a prosecutor to balance the duty to seek justice with the obligation to adhere strictly to the elements of a charged offense under Alabama law. Misinterpreting or overextending the definition of a criminal element can lead to wrongful convictions and undermine public trust in the justice system. The prosecutor must exercise careful judgment to ensure that the evidence presented directly supports each required element of the crime, as defined by Alabama statutes. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously examining the evidence to determine if it directly establishes each and every element of the crime of robbery in the first degree, as defined by Alabama Code Section 13A8-41. This requires confirming that the defendant took property from another person, that the taking was by force or threat of force, and that the defendant was armed with a deadly weapon or intended to use a deadly weapon. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principle of criminal law that the prosecution bears the burden of proving every element of the offense beyond a reasonable doubt, as mandated by Alabama's evidentiary rules and constitutional due process protections. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to argue that the defendant's intent to intimidate the victim, coupled with the presence of a weapon, is sufficient to prove robbery in the first degree, even if the weapon was not explicitly displayed or used to overcome resistance. This fails because Alabama Code Section 13A8-41 specifically requires that the taking be accomplished by force or by putting in fear. Mere intimidation without the use of force or fear to effect the taking is insufficient. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the defendant's prior criminal history or general dangerousness as a substitute for proving the elements of the current offense. This is professionally unacceptable because Alabama law, like all U.S. jurisdictions, prohibits the use of prior bad acts or character evidence to prove guilt of the charged crime, unless it falls within a specific, narrow exception. The focus must remain on the elements of the crime charged. A further incorrect approach is to assume that because the defendant possessed a weapon and had a confrontation with the victim, the elements of robbery are automatically met. This overlooks the crucial requirement that the force or threat of force must be directly linked to the taking of property. Without evidence establishing this causal connection, the charge cannot be sustained. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a methodical approach to case analysis. First, identify the specific criminal statute under which charges are brought. Second, break down the statute into its constituent elements. Third, rigorously assess the available evidence against each element, seeking direct proof. Fourth, consider any applicable defenses or mitigating factors. Finally, make a charging decision or proceed with prosecution only when there is sufficient evidence to prove all elements of the offense beyond a reasonable doubt. This systematic process ensures adherence to legal requirements and ethical obligations. Question 14. Consider a scenario in Alabama where an individual is accused of a crime that, according to the statute, carries a potential sentence of imprisonment for not more than 1 year or a fine. Which of the following is the most accurate classification of this offense under Alabama criminal law? Option A, a violation as it is not a serious offense. Option B, a felony due to the possibility of imprisonment. Option C, a misdemeanor, as the maximum potential incarceration is 1 year or less. Option D, an infraction because a fine is also an option. The correct answer is C, a misdemeanor, as the maximum potential incarceration is 1 year or less. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in accurately classifying a criminal offense under Alabama law, which has direct implications for the potential penalties, procedural rights of the accused, and the overall severity of the legal proceedings. Misclassification can lead to significant miscarriages of justice, including disproportionate sentencing or the application of inappropriate legal procedures. Careful judgment is required to apply the correct statutory definitions to the facts presented. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously examining the Alabama Code to determine the specific classification of the offense based on the elements of the crime and the potential punishment prescribed by statute. This approach aligns with the fundamental principle of due process, ensuring that individuals are charged and prosecuted according to the precise definitions and classifications established by the legislature. Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, distinguishes between felonies and misdemeanors based on the potential severity of punishment, particularly the length of incarceration. A felony is generally punishable by imprisonment for more than 1 year, while a misdemeanor is punishable by imprisonment for 1 year or less, or by a fine. Therefore, identifying the statutory maximum penalty is crucial for correct classification. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to classify the offense based solely on the defendant's prior criminal history. While prior offenses can influence sentencing, they do not alter the statutory classification of the current offense itself. The classification is determined by the elements of the crime and the penalties defined in the statute for that specific offense. Another incorrect approach is to rely on the prosecutor's initial charging decision without independent verification. Prosecutors have discretion, but their charging decisions must ultimately conform to the law. A third incorrect approach is to classify the offense based on the perceived moral blameworthiness of the act without reference to the statutory definitions. Legal classification must be objective and based on legislative intent as expressed in the Alabama Code, not subjective moral judgments. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the specific statute allegedly violated. Then they must consult the Alabama Code to determine the classification of that offense, felony or misdemeanor, and the corresponding penalties. This involves understanding the statutory definitions of felonies and misdemeanors in Alabama, particularly as they relate to the length of potential imprisonment. If the statute is unclear, or if the facts present ambiguity, seeking clarification through legal research or consultation with experienced colleagues is essential. The goal is always to ensure that the classification accurately reflects the law and the facts of the case. Question 15. During the evaluation of a client charged with burglary in the first degree in Alabama, who claims they were heavily intoxicated at the time of the alleged offense, what is the most legally sound and ethically appropriate strategy for the defense attorney to pursue regarding the intoxication defense? Option A. Argue that the defendant's severe voluntary intoxication prevented them from forming the specific intent required for burglary in the first degree, presenting evidence of their extreme incapacitation. Option B. Claim that the defendant's intoxication by itself negates their criminal responsibility for burglary in the first degree, regardless of the specific intent element. Option C. Assert that any level of voluntary intoxication should serve as a complete defense to the charge of burglary in the first degree. Option D. Focus solely on the fact that the defendant consumed a significant amount of alcohol. Implying this is sufficient to dismiss the charges. The correct answer is A. Argue that the defendant's severe voluntary intoxication prevented them from forming the specific intent required for burglary in the first degree, presenting evidence of their extreme incapacitation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the defense of voluntary intoxication in Alabama is narrowly construed and often unsuccessful, particularly for general intent crimes. Prosecutors will vigorously argue that intoxication does not negate criminal responsibility, unless it rises to the level of insanity or is so extreme that the defendant could not form the specific intent required for certain offenses. The defense attorney must navigate these legal hurdles while ethically representing their client. The best approach involves meticulously examining the specific intent required for the charged offense and presenting evidence that the defendant's intoxication was so severe it prevented the formation of that specific intent. This requires more than simply showing the defendant was drunk. It necessitates demonstrating a complete inability to comprehend the nature of their actions or to form the mental state necessary for the crime. This aligns with Alabama case law, such as Ex parte Scott, which clarifies that voluntary intoxication is not a defense to general intent crimes, and for specific intent crimes, must be so extreme as to negate the required mental state. An incorrect approach would be to argue that the defendant's intoxication, regardless of its severity, should automatically absolve them of responsibility for any crime committed while intoxicated. This fails to recognize that Alabama law does not recognize voluntary intoxication as a blanket defense and specifically distinguishes between general and specific intent crimes. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the fact that the defendant consumed alcohol without demonstrating how that consumption rendered them incapable of forming the requisite criminal intent. This overlooks the critical evidentiary burden of proving the incapacitation necessary to negate specific intent. Finally, presenting intoxication as a defense to a general intent crime, without any argument for insanity or extreme incapacitation negating specific intent, is legally unsound under Alabama law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific elements of the crime charged under Alabama law. This includes identifying whether the crime requires general or specific intent. Next, they must assess the factual circumstances, focusing on the degree and impact of the intoxication on the defendant's mental state at the time of the offense. This assessment should then be weighed against relevant Alabama statutes and case law concerning the intoxication defense. If the facts support a potential intoxication defense for a specific intent crime, the strategy should focus on demonstrating the incapacitation that prevented the formation of that specific intent, rather than a general claim of drunkenness. Question 16. Research into the definition of criminal law in Alabama reveals that certain actions are prohibited and punishable by the state. Considering the Alabama Criminal Code, which of the following best describes conduct that is definitively criminal in nature? Option A. Violations of rules or regulations established by state administrative agencies, regardless of whether criminal penalties are attached. Option B. Any behavior that is considered morally wrong or socially unacceptable by a significant portion of the public. Option C. The presence of a malicious intent to harm another person, even if no specific criminal statute is violated by the action taken. Option D. Actions that violate specific statutes enacted by the Alabama legislature and defined as criminal offenses, carrying prescribed penalties. Correct answer is D. Actions that violate specific statutes enacted by the Alabama legislature and defined as criminal offenses, carrying prescribed penalties. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires distinguishing between conduct that constitutes a criminal offense under Alabama law and conduct that, while potentially unethical or civilly actionable, does not rise to the level of crime. The definition of criminal law in Alabama is rooted in statutes enacted by the Alabama legislature and interpreted by the courts. Misunderstanding this definition can lead to incorrect advice, improper reporting, or even wrongful accusations. Careful judgment is required to apply the legal definitions accurately to specific factual circumstances. The correct approach involves identifying conduct that violates a specific criminal statute in Alabama, thereby constituting a crime. This requires a thorough understanding of the elements of various offenses as defined by Alabama code. For instance, if an individual's actions meet all the statutory elements of theft as defined in Alabama Code, Title 13A, Chapter 8, then that conduct is criminal. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the established legal framework for defining criminal behavior in Alabama. It focuses on whether the conduct has been legislatively prescribed as a crime with specific penalties. An incorrect approach would be to label any morally reprehensible or socially undesirable behavior as criminal without regard to whether it violates a specific Alabama criminal statute. For example, while lying to a business partner might be unethical and could lead to civil litigation for fraud or breach of contract. It is not inherently criminal unless it also meets the specific elements of a criminal offense like theft by deception under Alabama Code Section 13A8-2. Failing to require that conduct aligns with statutory definitions of crimes is a fundamental error in understanding criminal law. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any violation of a regulatory agency's rules or guidelines automatically constitutes a criminal offense. While regulatory violations can sometimes carry criminal penalties, they are not inherently criminal by definition. Many regulatory violations result in civil fines, administrative sanctions, or license revocation. Equating all regulatory noncompliance with criminal conduct oversimplifies the legal landscape and misapplies the definition of criminal law in Alabama. A further incorrect approach is to focus solely on the intent of the actor without considering whether their actions also constitute a prohibited act as defined by Alabama criminal statutes. While intent, mens rea, is a crucial element in many criminal offenses, it is not sufficient on its own to establish criminal liability. The actus reus must also be present and must correspond to the definition of a crime. Without both, there is no criminal offense. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic analysis of the alleged conduct against the specific definitions and elements of criminal offenses as provided in the Alabama Code. This includes identifying the relevant statutes, understanding the required mental state and physical act for each offense, and determining if the factual circumstances satisfy all these elements. If the conduct does not meet the statutory definition of a crime, it should not be classified as such, regardless of its ethical implications or potential for civil liability. Question 17. The risk matrix shows a homeowner in rural Alabama observing an individual attempting to force entry into their detached shed late at night. The homeowner is inside their main residence, armed with a legally possessed firearm, and has no immediate knowledge of whether the individual is armed or their intentions beyond entering the shed. What is the most legally sound and professionally responsible course of action for the homeowner in this situation? Option A. The homeowner should immediately exit their residence and fire their firearm in the direction of the individual to deter them from entering the shed. Option B. The homeowner should call the authorities and wait for their arrival without taking any other action, even if the individual successfully enters the shed. Option C. The homeowner should first attempt to verbally warn the individual to leave the property, and if the individual does not comply and continues to attempt forced entry, then assess if the individual's actions create a reasonable fear of imminent death or serious bodily harm to themselves or others before considering any further action. Option D. The homeowner should immediately confront the individual physically, attempting to subdue them without regard for the individual's potential resistance or armament. The correct answer is C. The homeowner should first attempt to verbally warn the individual to leave the property, and if the individual does not comply and continues to attempt forced entry, then assess if the individual's actions create a reasonable fear of imminent death or serious bodily harm to themselves or others before considering any further action. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a scenario where an individual is confronted with a potential trespasser on their property. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires immediate judgment under pressure, balancing the right to protect one's property with the legal limitations on the use of force, particularly deadly force, in Alabama. The core of the challenge lies in assessing the threat level and responding proportionally according to Alabama law. The correct approach involves assessing the immediate threat to life or serious bodily harm. In Alabama, the defense of property, while permissible, does not generally justify the use of deadly force unless the trespasser also poses a threat of death or serious bodily harm to the occupant or others. Therefore, the best professional practice is to de-escalate the situation if possible, warn the trespasser, and only resort to force, if necessary and legally permissible, after a clear and present danger to life or limb has been established. This aligns with Alabama Code sections concerning self-defense and the use of force, which prioritize human life and bodily integrity. An incorrect approach would be to immediately employ deadly force against the trespasser solely because they are on the property, without any indication that the trespasser poses a threat of death or serious bodily harm. This fails to adhere to Alabama's legal standards for the use of deadly force, which are not triggered by mere trespass. Another incorrect approach would be to physically assault the trespasser in a manner that is not proportionate to the perceived threat, potentially leading to criminal charges for assault even if the trespasser was not armed or overtly violent. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore the trespasser entirely, which, while avoiding immediate confrontation, could embolden the trespasser and potentially lead to further property damage or a more dangerous situation later, and does not fulfill the duty to protect one's property within legal bounds. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation, clear communication of boundaries, and a thorough assessment of the threat level before considering any form of physical intervention. This framework should include understanding the specific legal parameters of force allowed in Alabama for property defense and recognizing that the threshold for using deadly force is significantly higher than for mere trespass. Question 18. Governance review demonstrates that during the prosecution of a felony case in Alabama, the prosecutor intends to introduce prior inconsistent statements made by the defendant to a witness. The prosecutor is aware that the defense may object to these statements on hearsay grounds. Which of the following approaches best ensures the admissibility of this evidence and upholds the integrity of the trial process in Alabama? Option A. Wait until the witness is on the stand and the prosecutor attempts to elicit the prior inconsistent statements before addressing any potential hearsay objections. Option B. Assume the prior inconsistent statements are admissible and present them to the jury without any specific legal justification or pretrial review. Option C. Introduce the prior inconsistent statements through the witness without seeking any pretrial clarification or anticipating potential objections. Option D. File a motion in limine seeking a pretrial ruling on the admissibility of the defendant's prior inconsistent statements, outlining the legal basis for their admission under the Alabama Rules of Evidence. The correct answer is D. File a motion in limine seeking a pretrial ruling on the admissibility of the defendant's prior inconsistent statements, outlining the legal basis for their admission under the Alabama Rules of Evidence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a prosecutor in Alabama concerning the admissibility of evidence during a criminal trial. The prosecutor must navigate the Alabama Rules of Evidence and constitutional due process requirements to ensure that evidence presented is legally obtained and relevant, while also respecting the defendant's rights. Failure to do so can lead to mistrials, appeals, and the suppression of crucial evidence, undermining the pursuit of justice. Careful judgment is required to balance the state's interest in prosecuting crime with the defendant's right to a fair trial. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively addressing potential evidentiary challenges before they arise during trial. This includes conducting thorough pretrial investigations, reviewing all evidence for compliance with the Alabama Rules of Evidence, particularly concerning hearsay, relevance, and chain of custody, and filing appropriate motions in limine to seek rulings on the admissibility of questionable evidence. This approach, which involves seeking a pretrial ruling on the admissibility of the defendant's prior inconsistent statements, demonstrates a commitment to procedural fairness and efficiency. By addressing the issue before jury selection or opening statements, the prosecutor minimizes the risk of a mistrial or a successful appeal based on improper evidence admission. This aligns with the principles of due process and the efficient administration of justice as contemplated by Alabama law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves waiting until the prosecution attempts to introduce the prior inconsistent statements during the trial to address the potential hearsay issue. This is problematic because it risks the judge sustaining an objection, requiring the prosecutor to scramble for an alternative strategy or potentially lose the opportunity to present critical evidence. It also disrupts the trial flow and can prejudice the jury against the prosecution. Furthermore, if the statements are deemed inadmissible without a proper legal basis for exception, it could lead to a mistrial or grounds for appeal. Another incorrect approach is to assume the prior inconsistent statements are admissible without any legal basis or pretrial review, and to present them to the jury without seeking clarification from the court. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the Alabama Rules of Evidence. If the statements are indeed inadmissible hearsay, their introduction would be a clear violation of evidentiary rules and could lead to a reversal of any conviction. A third incorrect approach is to attempt to introduce the statements through a witness who has no direct knowledge of their content or context, hoping the jury will infer their significance. This is speculative and unprofessional. It fails to establish the necessary foundation for the evidence and likely constitutes inadmissible hearsay or irrelevant testimony, jeopardizing the prosecution's case and potentially violating the defendant's right to a trial based on competent evidence. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a proactive and diligent approach to evidence management. This involves understanding the relevant rules of evidence for the jurisdiction, in this case, Alabama, conducting thorough pretrial reviews of all evidence, and anticipating potential objections. When faced with potentially problematic evidence, such as prior inconsistent statements that may raise hearsay concerns, the professional decision-making process should prioritize seeking pretrial judicial guidance through motions in limine. This strategy ensures that evidentiary issues are resolved before they can derail the trial, upholding both the integrity of the legal process and the defendant's right to a fair hearing. Question 19. Governance review demonstrates that a prosecutor in Alabama is evaluating evidence against an individual found near a convenience store shortly after a robbery occurred. The individual was seen speaking with the known perpetrator of the robbery approximately an hour before the incident, and a small amount of cash, similar in denomination to that stolen, was found in their pocket. The prosecutor must determine if sufficient evidence exists to charge the individual with a crime related to the robbery. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the requirements of Alabama criminal law and procedure for establishing criminal liability? Option A. Charge the individual with conspiracy to commit robbery, arguing that their conversation with the perpetrator an hour prior to the robbery, coupled with their presence nearby, constitutes an agreement to commit the crime. Option B. Charge the individual if there is credible evidence that they actively participated in the planning or execution of the robbery, or intentionally aided, abetted, or encouraged the known perpetrator in committing the offense, demonstrating both criminal intent and a culpable act. Option C. Charge the individual solely on the basis of the small amount of cash found in their possession, assuming it is proceeds from the robbery, without direct evidence linking them to the commission of the crime itself. Option D. Charge the individual based on their proximity to the crime scene and their prior association with the known perpetrator, as this suggests a level of involvement or knowledge of the impending criminal activity. Correct answer is B. Charge the individual if there is credible evidence that they actively participated in the planning or execution of the robbery, or intentionally aided, abetted, or encouraged the known perpetrator in committing the offense, demonstrating both criminal intent and a culpable act. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires distinguishing between mere presence at crime scene and active participation, a crucial element in establishing criminal liability under Alabama law. The prosecutor must carefully assess the defendant's actions and intent to determine if the elements of the crime are met, avoiding overreach or insufficient evidence. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the defendant's conduct in relation to the alleged criminal act, focusing on whether they possessed the requisite criminal intent, mens rea, and performed a culpable actus reus, as defined by Alabama statutes. This means looking for evidence that the defendant actively assisted, encouraged, or facilitated the commission of the crime, or was a principal offender. For instance, if the defendant provided the weapon used in the assault, acted as a lookout with knowledge of the impending crime, or shared in the proceeds of the theft, these actions would strongly indicate complicity. Alabama law, particularly concerning accomplice liability and conspiracy, requires proof of intent to aid or abet the commission of the offense. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the defendant's proximity to the crime scene or association with known offenders. Alabama law does not criminalize mere presence or passive association. Charging someone based on their being in the vicinity of a crime, without evidence of their involvement in planning or executing the offense, would fail to establish the necessary elements of criminal liability and could lead to a wrongful prosecution. Another incorrect approach is to assume guilt based on circumstantial evidence that does not directly link the defendant to the criminal act or intent. While circumstantial evidence can be used, it must be sufficient to exclude every reasonable hypothesis except that of guilt. For example, if the defendant was merely present at a party where drugs were later found, but there is no evidence they possessed, sold, or intended to possess the drugs, this alone is insufficient for a conviction. A third incorrect approach is to charge the defendant with a more serious offense than the evidence supports, based on speculation or a desire to secure a conviction. Alabama law requires that the charges align with the proven elements of the offense. Overcharging without sufficient evidence to prove all elements of the more serious crime is unethical and legally unsound. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a meticulous review of all available evidence against the specific elements of the charged offense under Alabama law. This involves identifying direct and credible circumstantial evidence of both the actus reus and mens rea. If the evidence is insufficient to prove all elements beyond a reasonable doubt, the professional should consider alternative charges that are supported by the evidence or decline to prosecute. Ethical considerations demand adherence to the principle that a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and the burden of proof rests entirely with the prosecution. Question 20. Governance review demonstrates that during a recent inventory audit in Birmingham, Alabama, a retail store discovered that an employee, acting with intent to permanently deprive the owner, had stolen several items. The stolen items include 3 high-end blenders purchased by the store for $350 each, 2 coffee makers purchased for $150 each, and 5 sets of artisanal cookware purchased for $400 per set. Based on Alabama Code Section 13A8-4, theft of property, what is the minimum felony classification of theft the employee's actions would likely constitute, and what is the mens rea element most directly addressed by this calculation? Option A. Class a misdemeanor based on the number of individual items stolen. Option B. Class C felony, based on the subjective assessment of the item's current condition and estimated depreciation. Option C. Class D felony, based on the calculation of the total market value of the stolen property to determine the degree of theft. Option D. Class B felony, based on the intent to permanently deprive the owner of property, irrespective of its value. The correct answer is C. Class D felony, based on the calculation of the total market value of the stolen property to determine the degree of theft. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a precise understanding of Alabama's mens rea statutes, specifically how intent is measured and proven in a criminal context, and how that relates to the calculation of potential penalties. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between different levels of culpability and applying the correct legal standards to a factual situation involving a quantitative element. Accurate application of the law is paramount to avoid miscarriages of justice and ensure appropriate sentencing. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves meticulously calculating the potential value of the stolen property based on the documented purchase prices and the statutory definition of value under Alabama law for theft offenses. This approach directly addresses the core of the mens rea element for theft, which often hinges on the intent to permanently deprive the owner of property of a certain value. Alabama Code Section 13A8-1 defines value as the market value of the property at the time and place of the offense. By using the documented purchase prices, which serve as a reasonable proxy for market value in the absence of other evidence, one can accurately determine the degree of the theft offense. For example, if the total value exceeds $500, it would likely constitute a Class C felony, whereas a value between $500 and $500 would be a Class D felony, and so on, as outlined in Alabama Code Section 13A8-4. This method ensures that the mens rea assessment is grounded in objective, quantifiable evidence directly relevant to the statutory elements of the crime. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply sum the number of items stolen without considering their individual or aggregate value. This fails to engage with the statutory definition of value, which is crucial for determining the severity of the theft charge, and consequently, the mens rea required for different degrees of the offense. Law does not punish based on quantity alone, but on the economic impact of the deprivation. Another incorrect approach is to estimate the value based on a subjective assessment of wear and tear without any objective basis. While depreciation is a factor in market value, a purely subjective estimation lacks the rigor required by Alabama's criminal statutes. The law requires a more concrete basis for valuation, such as market value or, in its absence, the cost of replacement. Relying solely on personal judgment without reference to established valuation principles or evidence would be legally insufficient. A further incorrect approach is to focus solely on the intent to steal without quantifying the value of the property. While intent to permanently deprive is a necessary component of theft, the degree of the offense and the associated mens rea are significantly influenced by the value of the property. Ignoring the value element means failing to properly categorize the crime, which could lead to an inappropriate charge and sentencing recommendation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such cases by first identifying the specific criminal statute applicable, e.g., Alabama Code Title 13A, Chapter 8, Part 2 Theft. They must then break down the elements of the offense, paying particular attention to the mens rea requirement and any associated quantitative elements like value. The next step is to gather all available evidence related to the value of the stolen property, prioritizing objective data such as receipts, invoices, or appraisals. Mathematical calculations should then be performed to determine the aggregate value, comparing it against the statutory thresholds for different degrees of the offense. This systematic, evidence-based approach ensures that legal conclusions are sound and defensible.